Hello and welcome to Social Value UK's webinar on the impact questions 5 through 9, those that focus primarily on quantitative information. The purpose of this webinar is to provide a bit more of a deep dive into those impact questions, highlighting the importance of quantitative information to help us make improved decisions. As a brief recap in terms of Social Value UK, we are part of an international network of networks, part of Social Value International, and we all share a mission to change the way the world accounts for value. By taking account of value in a broader and more holistic sense, taking account of the financial, environmental, and social effects of our activities, we believe that we can improve decision making to reduce inequality and environmental degradation, and also improve the well-being of people. These webinars are designed to be standalone webinars, and each has addressed this central question of what is social value, but it's always important to have a brief recap to ensure that we have a reasonably shared understanding. Essentially, we're talking about changes to people's lives, be they forecasted or evaluative in a retrospective sense. We're talking about outcomes, the effects, the consequences of different activities. It's important to understand that people may have more than a single change that they experience, a single outcome, and people value those changes differently. This is central to the decision-making process. If we wish to be able to create more impacts, it's important to be able to understand which are the most important changes that people experience in their lives. This is social value, understanding the relative importance that people place on the changes they experience in their lives. And if we do so using financial proxies, financial approximations, we can quantify the relative importance of changes to people's outcomes using the language of money, and this allows us to conduct social return on investment, SROI assessments. The purpose for doing so is initially to measure, to be able to understand how much of a change has been created and the importance of those changes. But central to this is the ability to then manage this information, be able to use the insights from people, understanding what's changed and the importance of those changes, to be able to increase the positive changes and reduce the negative changes, managing the impacts of our activities. If we do so on a continuous basis, where we're looking to always strive to create greater impacts, we can start to talk about having a philosophy of impact thinking or maximizing social value and social impacts, creating as much positive difference as we can with the resources we have available to us. In order to be able to account for social value, that is to be able to measure, manage and maximize the impacts of our work, the principles of social value provide a flexible framework for us to be able to think about how to do this. Central to those principles is the involvement of stakeholders. Stakeholders provide that information about what has changed in their lives. They provide information about the importance of those changes. Those pieces of information are central to an organization being able to understand the most material changes. We have principles to ensure we do not overclaim. We will also be transparent in any judgments made and have appropriate verification of the results. Implicit to the principles is the notion of being responsive, that is using the information, again to manage our impact, doing something with it. Having got some insight from our stakeholders, what are we going to do with it? Further information on the principles of social value is available on the Social Value UK and Social Value International websites. On a more operational sense, embedding the ideas of social value, there are a central set of key impact questions. The impact questions provide a way of structuring the way we think about impacts, again allowing us to account for social value, measuring, managing, and maximising. Previous webinars have provided an overview of the impact questions and subsequently delved into those around the mainly qualitative data. This webinar focuses on those impact questions with a mainly quantitative perspective, looking at how we can measure changes, how much of each change has happened, the relative importance, the duration of changes, and the idea of asking how much of each change is caused by our activities. Overlaying these impact questions are important considerations. Who answers the questions is absolutely central to an effective way of accounting for social value, ensuring that the correct people are involved, again those stakeholders, any individuals or groups of individuals that can affect or be affected by decision making. Also central to these impact questions is the idea of enough precision for the decision. Based on the decision or decisions being influenced by the information, we will need different degrees of rigour, different degrees of precision and accuracy. The more impactful the decision, the more costly the decision to implement and reverse, the more precision we will require. If the decision is less impactful, and again perhaps less costly to implement and less costly to reverse if we need to do so, we will need less precision for that decision. But these questions provide a consistent set by which we can structure how we think about impact, but they can be applied with varying degrees of rigour, ensuring that the results we get, the evidence we receive, is fit for purpose. The previous webinars focused on those qualitative questions, questions 1 through 4. Questions 3 and 4 in particular around who are affected, those stakeholders and how they are affected, the outcomes of their activities, help us to have a better understanding of relevant outcomes. This webinar is intended to go beyond the relevance and start to talk about the significance of those different changes, helping us to understand the magnitude of the changes. This helps us to better understand the answer to impact question 10, which asks us which changes matter to those people affected. This will have an implication or have implications for our decision making, as we will understand both the relevant and significant outcomes of our activities. For further information about this, please do see the Standard on Materiality, again available on the Social Value UK and Social Value International websites. Moving into impact questions 5 and 6, these two questions go together. What we're asking is how to measure the changes. What indicators do we need? And based upon that, we should get the information about how much of each change has happened. So for each outcome, we need at least one indicator, one way of measuring the amount of change that has happened. This is going beyond just measuring if a change has occurred or not just saying did it happen, yes or no, but also trying to understand the extent of change, the amount of change, or the delta of change, if you like. Indicators can be a mixture. We could use subjective and or objective indicators to measure the change, and we may need more than one. Again, the key to this is understanding enough precision for the decision. If one indicator is enough, if it is good enough and provides evidence that can support our decision making, it is enough precision for the decision. If not, we may need to use a different indicator or perhaps more than one to answer that question of how much of each change has happened. In an ideal world, we have a baseline. We have a position where people are on a scale, on an indicator before they join our activities, before we start working with them. The reality is that is often not the case. This should not prevent us being able to understand how much change has happened. But rather than being able to ask stakeholders where are they at the beginning of an initiative, or perhaps before they've started working with us and then having a follow-up, we will have to ask the question, looking backwards, retrospectively, how much change has happened as a result of our activities. This may not provide the same level of rigour as having a baseline score, but we cannot allow having no baseline score to prevent us having any evidence that could help us make better decisions. As outlined, there are different options, different indicators that can help us measure the same change. And again, the idea being enough precision for the decision. Stakeholders can absolutely be involved in helping us identify appropriate indicators, but it's also advised that we speak to the decision maker or decision makers to understand their requirements as well. We want to ensure that the indicators are both useful to stakeholders, but they also inform our decision-making process. We can think about the different options, starting at binary, where we have a simple choice. Has something changed for you, yes or no? The example in front of you being around stress. But that doesn't necessarily give us enough information. Remember that the impact question is asking how much change has happened. A binary indicator does not provide us with that information. It just tells us if something has changed or not. In order to understand how much change, we need to move into using scale-based indicators. As it says in front of you, we can use scales such as 1 to 5, 1 to 10, as long as the stakeholder knows which is the lowest and which is the highest point on the indicator. This is more rigorous than a binary indicator, starting to give us the information about the extent of change, but there are limitations to scale-based indicators. If one person identifies themselves as a 3 out of 5, it is not necessarily comparable that somebody else saying 3 out of 5 is meaning essentially the same thing. To improve the level of rigour, we start to talk about requiring validated scales. A validated scale, rather than using 1 to 5, for example, will use a scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree. There are lots of validated scales out there. We see a growth in things such as emoji-based scales. Again, improving the likelihood that one person identifying themselves on a point in the scale is meaning largely the same as somebody else identifying themselves as being at the same position on the scale. Again, increasing in levels of rigor, it may be that we need to ask more than one question to understand the change in a particular outcome. This is where questionnaires, using a series of questions, again with validated options, can provide even greater rigor. But again, it may be that we need to use more than one, and we may want to also include an objective indicator to supplement the subjective indicator or indicators that are being used. Here's an example of a validated questionnaire. This is the Short, Warwick and Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, or SWEMWEBS. This has 7 questions to understand positive mental health, or as an alternative, depression, if you like. So these are all validated options, ranging from 1 to 5, from none of the time to all of the time, asking a series of questions, or in this case statements, in order to be able to measure the amount of change that a person has experienced on this indicator, on this outcome being around depression or mental well-being. This is just, of course, one option. There are many other options out there, and Global Value Exchange is a great resource. Please do have a look at GVE. It has a range of indicators that have been used by other people to measure different changes in outcomes. The previous webinar highlighted our consistent case study where we're looking at a social enterprise that supports people into employment, supporting long-term unemployed people to find the work that they desire. Going through the chain of events, we have the activities of the provision of training and support to long-term unemployed people. We have outputs around the number of people trained, outcomes in that some of the number of people that gain successful certification. A subsequent outcome to that is that some people gain a job paying above minimum wage, and others have a reduced mental well-being, or depression if you prefer. On this illustration now, we have included indicators. The indicator for gaining a job is that somebody is paid above minimum wage. The indicator for reduced mental well-being is the validated questionnaire we've just previously seen, the Short, Warwick and Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale. One of the real advantages, in addition to be able to understand how much change has happened, is that when we're forecasting the impact, we can start to set targets. We can start to set thresholds, a minimum expectation for the amount of positive change and a maximum expectation for the amount of negative change. So, for example, on the previous slide, we saw that some people become depressed because they do not gain the job that they wish to receive. We could set a threshold for this. So there's a 35-point scale on the SWEMWEBS indicator. We could set a threshold that says this is the maximum amount of change or the maximum amount of depression that we are willing to accept before we change our activities. We're not able to say what the threshold should be. This is very much down to the organisation in consultation with their stakeholders to identify relevant thresholds. In this case, for a negative change, what is the maximum amount of depression you would accept before changing your activities? Some people may say, of course, that any depression in people is morally wrong and you would change your activities. But that is for an organisation to make an informed decision based on the involvement of their stakeholders. So now we've taken this information, again, exactly the same scenario, and we've started to build in forecasted targets, thresholds based on our indicators. So it's no longer that we just have a number of people trained, we know there are 100. We know that 60 people gain skills, 40 do not, and have become more depressed. This is our target. We are saying we have an expectation that, unfortunately in this case, 40 out of the 100 people will not gain employment. But what we are saying here is we have a threshold that we expect no more than 1 point increase on the depression scale. So that is our maximum threshold. Essentially, as an organisation, we are saying that if anybody becomes depressed more than 1 point, we have to change our activities. When we look at the positive change around people gaining work, again, the indicator there is around minimum wage. So people must get a job that pays above minimum wage. and we have a target that 30 people will do so. I hope you're looking at this and seeing a bit of a problem with this illustration. We have a completeness check. If we have 100 people trained, 60 gain work and 40 do not, or 60 people gain skills rather, and 40 do not, we only have 30 getting a job. This is an intended error. We want people to be complete. So now, using the same example as we've previously seen, we're adding indicators to our different outcomes as well as the outputs, but we're also starting to set targets or thresholds. We now have a better understanding, and we know that 100 people were trained, of which 60 gained new skills, which means that 40 do not. As a result of 40 people not getting the skills that they wish and therefore not getting the job that they desire, we're talking about the negative outcome here, that people are depressed. But what we are saying is people are becoming depressed on the short Warwick and Edinburgh mental well-being scale, and we're setting a target here that nobody will become depressed more than a single point. If so, we will change our activities. We will hold ourselves to account and say that anything beyond the threshold of 1 point is too much, and we will do something about it. The other people that gain a job, with the indicator being payment above minimum wage, we have set a target that 30 people out of the 100 will get a job. Again, target setting is absolutely central to being able to hold ourselves to account, looking at opportunities to no longer just ask the question that says, what impact have we created? Rather asking the question of, have we created as much impact as we could with the resources we have available? I'm hoping that people are looking at this illustration and spotting a problem with it. There is a completeness issue here. We are not being complete. If we have 100 people trained, 60 gaining skills, 40 not, and not getting the job and therefore becoming depressed, but of the others, only 30, our target is only 30 will get a job, we are incomplete. We are missing certain people. Using the same example as before, we're now including indicators. Using our indicators, we're able to start setting targets. Our target is that 100 people are trained, of which 60 gain new skills. We hope that of those 60, 30 people get a job that pays above minimum wage. Again, our indicator has a threshold of saying at least minimum wage. Now, there is a problem here with this illustration. If we intend 60 people to gain new skills, of which only 30 get a job, we have a completeness issue here. This is a really important point to highlight, that often we are not complete when accounting for social value. If 60 people gain new skills, and we only have a target that 30 of them will subsequently gain work, that suggests that 30 people are no longer being accounted for. Of those people that do not gain new skills, the remaining 40, again, the indicator being the short Warwick and Edinburgh mental well-being scale, we have a threshold that we are targeting people will not become depressed by more than a single point on the Warwick and Edinburgh mental well-being scale. Again, the central importance of target setting is being able to hold ourselves to account. If we find subsequently that less than 30 people get a job, we can start to look at our activities and see how we can improve them. If more than 40 people become depressed, if 40 people become depressed by more than 1 point on the particular indicator, again, we can hold ourselves to account. We are starting to be able to set targets. This is absolutely central to being able to go beyond measuring social impacts, to be able to manage and maximize those impacts. This may be enough information for us to start making decisions, to start changing the way we do things. Once we understand that people are experiencing negative changes to a certain degree, we may say this is sufficient information for us to change what we're doing. We may, however, say we need more confidence in the data, and we can therefore go into the other impact questions. In summary, of course, we may need more than a single indicator. Indicators explicitly are designed to tell us how much change has happened, not just if a change has been experienced or not. We can use a combination of objective and subjective indicators, and this information can help us refine our segments. It may be that we find different people have different extents of change, and it helps us understand, based on their characteristics, how we can tailor and target our services to create more impact. But central to all of this is the ability or the effectiveness of setting thresholds. Moving into the next impact question, where we start to understand the relative importance of those different changes. The motivation for doing this is being able to compare different changes to different outcomes experienced by the same stakeholder group. Understanding the subjective value, the worth, the importance of those different changes through the involvement of stakeholders can really help us prioritise our resources to create the most impact. We do this in a quantitative sense, and we can also use the language of money to do so, again helping us to understand the social return on our investments. There are different options to being able to value changes, all quantitative. We can, of course, value things qualitatively, but in order to be able to have that consistent unit of comparison, we do need to value things in a quantitative sense. This webinar will go briefly into the difference between the equal weight, variable weight, and the potential to use the language of money to represent the variable weight. Key to all of this is the phrase that we keep reminding ourselves of, enough precision for the decision. We need to ensure that the information is fit for purpose and will influence our decision-making process. In order to be able to compare different changes to outcomes, we need a consistent unit, a consistent language in order to be able to understand the different value that people attach to changes in their lives. We can do so using equal weights, which is where we ask a stakeholder to rank those changes in order of importance. Perhaps if they've experienced 3 changes, we ask the stakeholder which is the least important, which is the most important, and which is in the middle. We can use variable weights, where we start to have a greater understanding of the relative importance of changes. So perhaps we ask stakeholders on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is most important, how important is this change? Again, we're able to then compare those different changes using a consistent unit. We can also do so using the language of money, where we use financial proxies or financial approximations in order to represent the value of those changes. Central to all of this is again the phrase that we hear consistently, enough precision for the decision. If we need to use the language of money in order to improve our decision making, then we can absolutely do so, but it may be that we do not need to use the language of money in order to be able to influence our decision making. Using the previous example where we have people who are gaining the job and people who are not, we have some example illustrations, some example weightings here. So in this case, we've asked our stakeholders, those people experiencing the changes, how important was the job on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is most important? The stakeholders have identified the value of that change as 2 out of 10. It is important. But the stakeholders that are now more depressed as a result of not gaining the job have indicated that the importance of that change is 8 out of 10. In that case, 4 times as important as those people gaining the job. Again, the real central importance to understanding the value of different changes is being able to understand, being able to compare them, being able to make decisions to prioritize our resources. We'll go into this in a little bit more detail. We can use the language of money in order to value different changes as well. We are not talking about prices here. We are still talking very much about the value of changes. To do so, we use financial proxies or approximations. This can really help with the communication to external stakeholders, being able to talk about the social return on investment. But there are potential risks and limitations of using the language of money, and it can be misused, and often stakeholder preferences are ignored. A further webinar goes into more detail on the different options of monetizing and how we can also use language of ranking and weighting of changes to influence our decision making. But briefly, let's have a look at how we can really listen to the voice of stakeholders in order to understand the relative importance of changes they have experienced. So rather than talk about outcomes as being around a satisfactory job and depression, for example, we're just going to talk about outcomes A, B, and C. Initially, we've asked stakeholders, the people with experience of those changes, how important is outcome A, outcome B, and outcome C on a scale of 1 to 10. That is the weighting column, where we can see 8, 4, and 1. That information alone provides some real insight into stakeholders' preferences. What the stakeholders are telling us here is that outcome C, although it is important, is not as important as the other outcomes. Outcome B, in fact, is 4 times as valuable as outcome C, and outcome A is 8 times as valuable as outcome C. If we only had that information, that should really inform our decision making. But again, we may want to use the language of money, financial proxies, in order to be able to communicate our impacts to other people and potentially be able to compare different activities that we run within our organizations. So let's imagine that we've used a different one of the approaches to monetization, and we've identified that outcome B, again through our stakeholder involvement, has a value of $10,000. Ask yourself the question, how valuable is outcome A and outcome C using the language of money? This is where we're talking about using anchoring is really to try and limit the potential risk of us stopping listening to stakeholders, stopping listening to the voice of the stakeholder who has experienced that change. If they've already told us the weighting, the importance of those changes, using the language of numbers rather than the language of money, we have all of the information we need to be able to identify the monetary value of outcome A and outcome C. We have the anchor of outcome B as $10,000. Outcome A is twice as valuable, and outcome C is a quarter as important. Based on that information, we can simply divide or multiply accordingly by those different weightings. Again, outcome B has a monetary value of $10,000. Outcome A is twice as valuable, therefore has a monetary value of $20,000. Outcome C was valued by the stakeholders only 25% that of the value of outcome B, therefore it has a monetary value that is equally 25% of outcome B. Using anchoring provides real advantages and allows us to continue to listen to the voice of stakeholders. There are different approaches to understanding the monetary value of different changes experienced by stakeholders. This webinar will not go into each of these in turn. More information is again available on the Social Value UK and Social Value International websites, but the subsequent webinar will provide a deeper dive into the different monetary techniques. But let's remind ourselves of the purpose of doing so. The real central importance of doing so is to be able to make decisions, improve decisions that take account of the value that people identify on the changes they have experienced. Regardless of whether we use the language of money or just have a quantitative understanding of the value of those different changes, we should make the same decision. Again, using the previous example, where we see that the job satisfaction had a value, a worth of 2 out of 10, and depression was worth 8 out of 10. We now understand that depression is 4 times as valuable as the increased job satisfaction. That should tell us that we should be looking to reduce depression, reducing the number of people that experience that valuable change. Imagine the situation where we have 100 people on the program. We now understand that we need at least 4 times as many people to get a job as those becoming depressed, just to break even. If we had the language of money, if that was $2 and $8, we would still make the same decision. If that was $20 and $80, we would still make the same decision. The central importance of this is understanding the relative importance. The difference between outcome A and outcome B in this case is 4 times. That tells us that outcome B, depression in this case, is the most important change experienced by people, which in this case is a negative change. We should therefore be looking to mitigate, reduce, and eliminate that negative change. This could give us enough confidence to make our decisions. It may be that that information alone is enough to inform our decision making. But of course, it may be that we want more confidence, which comes through greater evidence, looks at using the next impact question. In summary, it is centrally important that value is informed by those stakeholders with experience of the change or those that are likely to experience the change. If we decide that if we make a value judgment that we think outcome A is more or less important than outcome B, we increase the risk that we make a suboptimal decision. Stakeholders must be involved in identifying the value of changes. Having that consistent unit, be it quantitative and or monetary, allows us to better understand where we can create most value for people and helps prioritize our resource allocation. When we do so using the language of money, we can compare the value of changes to the value of the inputs required. This allows us to do SROI, social return on investment. Going into the next impact question, question 8. asks two things. It asks how long changes last, but also how long we need to measure the changes for. So again, we have the job, a satisfactory job, and we have levels of depression. The question we're asking is, how long do those changes last? And again, the principle number one, involvement of stakeholders, can really give us some great insight as to how long changes do last, or how long people think changes will last for them. We're also needing to ask ourselves the question as organisations of how long we are accountable for the change, how long we are accountable for those outcomes. This should also inform how frequently we are collecting evidence. So again, the questions we're asking is, how long does a change last? But also, how long are we accountable for those changes? Let's again put that into context. Thinking about our previous situation, or our consistent case study, where people are gaining jobs that they're satisfied with, again based on the indicator being at least minimum wage. We can ask stakeholders, how long do you want that change to last? How long do you want to stay in a satisfactory job? Now, many stakeholders would often talk about wanting to stay in the job for the remainder of their working lives. That's perfectly reasonable. We then ask ourselves the other question of, well, how long are we as an organisation accountable for that change? And what we're really saying here is, what is, because this is a positive change, what is the minimum amount of what is the minimum amount of time that the stakeholder should stay in the job for our activities to be considered as creating valuable changes? So let's assume again the stakeholder has said they want to stay in the job for the remainder of their working lives, which could be a number of decades. It would take a lot of resources for us to measure that on a consistent basis. We therefore need to make an informed judgment that says we will measure that change for a period of time, be it 1, 2, 5, 10 years. Again, bearing in mind the idea of enough precision for the decision. If we decide, for example, to measure for 2 years, what we are saying is, if on average people, and we've set a target, of course, that we want 30 people to be in a job, if we find that less than 30 people are still in that satisfactory job within that 2-year period that we've established, then we are accountable for this. We need to do something. We need to change our activities to make them more effective. We will have to make judgments about this, but they should be informed. We can be informed by our stakeholders, again, asking how long they would like the change to last. But it may also be that we use some existing evidence. Perhaps in the situation of people remaining in satisfactory employment, it could be related to national requirements in terms of probationary periods. It could be related to perhaps the average amount of time that a certain group of people remain in employment. So that's the duration question, but we also need to think about frequency. How often, how frequently should we collect evidence? Again, if we think about the scenario where we're perhaps saying we're going to measure people being in a job for 2 years, it's not enough to wait for 2 years. If we wait 2 years to then find out that people are not in those satisfactory employment positions, it's too late for us to do anything about it within that time period. Other people may have gone through our program who are now on a path where they will not maintain the job for that period of time. When we account for financial value, we do so internally on a quarterly, if not monthly basis, in order to be responsive, in order to identify things that are going well and do more of them, and also identify where things are not going as well as we intended, and we can do something about it. The idea that social accounting should follow the same analogies as financial accounting is really something we should bear in mind. Again, that implicit principle of being responsive, we need evidence gathered frequently enough in order to inform our ability to be responsive. This again may give us greater confidence to make decisions. If we find that people are not experiencing positive changes for long enough, we may do something about it. We may decide that we have enough information if we find out that people are experiencing negative changes for too long a time period. That could give us enough confidence to make a decision, but of course we may want more confidence, more evidence, and that comes from our final impact question, question 9, which is asking how much of each change is caused by our activities. What is our impact? This is essentially related to the impact question. It's the definition of impact, that it has a growing global consensus, is really understanding the amount of changes that an intervention or activity can claim responsibility for. We need to ask a series of questions to understand our impact or our contribution. We're talking about issues around deadweight, attribution, and drop-off. Deadweight or counterfactual is essentially asking the likelihood that changes could have happened without us. So imagining the situation where our intervention or our activities are not available, asking those stakeholders, those people, what is the chance that those changes could have been experienced without us? Attribution is essentially asking about the contribution of others, those not contractually involved, those individuals or organisations that also help to create changes in the lives of people. And if we're talking about impact or value going beyond a single year, we should also think about drop-off. So if a change persists for more than 12 months, what we're really asking is, well, what's the rate by which the value deteriorates or depreciates that belongs to that initial intervention? What's the reduction rate year upon year that our activities, again, can claim responsibility for? Those questions, along with the question around displacement that was addressed when we asked impact question 3, around stakeholders experiencing negative changes, really help us understand our impact. So thinking back to our targets previously, our target was that 30 people would get a job that pays at least minimum wage. Perhaps when understanding our impact, our causality, asking those deadweight and attribution-based questions, perhaps we find that only 20 of the 30 people who did get a job are down to us. Again, the ability of having a target, a threshold, the information in front of us is simply saying we have not met our target. We should be looking at our activities. We are accountable. We can do things differently. We can create greater impacts. We've also discovered that we had a target that no more than 40 people would become depressed, and that's what the information is presenting to us. But actually our target was that people would only become depressed by 1 point on the Warwick and Edinburgh mental well-being scale. The information in front of us at the moment is saying that people are depressed by at least 8 points. We are significantly failing to hit our targets. People are far more depressed than we would allow or that we have set a target for. And we are also identifying that 10 people less are gaining jobs than we targeted. Again, we are accountable for this. We can do things differently. And next year or next month, we can create greater impacts with this information. How do we identify some sources for this information? The counterfactual or the deadweight, there are different options. At the very least, and we should probably do this in all cases, we can ask stakeholders, what is the chance that these changes could have been experienced without us? Now that is a lower level of rigour, but again, it could be good enough. It could provide enough precision for the decision, but perhaps not. Perhaps we want more rigorous data. To do so, we can compare our stakeholders and their experiences with national or regional data. Perhaps again, looking at the number of people within an age group that we support to find employment compared to a regional database of the same sort or similar people gaining jobs. Perhaps we want to compare with a control group, and there are different options within this. Initially, we could look for people with similar characteristics. So thinking about a different scenario, perhaps we've supported children to increase their literacy skills. Well, we could look for a school of a similar nature, children of a similar socioeconomic status, family backgrounds, and so forth. Again, people with similar characteristics, comparing the experiences of the stakeholders we are working with in comparison to stakeholders of similar characteristics. In some cases, there is the opportunity to do so in a more random sense, where we talk about RCTs or randomized control trials. This is where people, the stakeholders, are randomly assigned to the treatment or the control groups, where people do not know whether they are receiving an intervention or not. This is often applied in terms of medical practices, where a new drug or new prescription is being trialled. Some people receive the intervention and other people receive a placebo to gain a very rigorous understanding of the change that is created through the intervention. This is often not possible with many social interventions. In terms of being able to calculate and understand attribution, there's often less data readily available to do so, but of course we can always ask our stakeholders, asking them a question of who else contributed? Who in your life, which individuals or organisations are contributing to the changes that you have experienced? We could also ask other stakeholders. perhaps looking at other institutions or other partners that we're involved with, asking for their opinion. We are again gaining a more informed judgment. It may be that we look at our financial contribution in comparison to the financial contribution of others, and perhaps that helps us identify our contribution and the attribution of others. So, for example, if we are contributing 30% of the resources required, perhaps we say that our contribution is 30% and the attribution of others is the remaining 70%. We've now gone through all of the impact questions where we directly ask people for their evidence, for their information, and for their insights. We should now have enough confidence to understand the value of our activities and the impact of our activities. We should now have enough confidence to make changes to our activities. If not, we don't have enough precision for the decision, and perhaps we've not done our evidence gathering sufficiently well. Perhaps the qualitative and/or the quantitative information is not good enough. In summary, though, thinking about that final impact question where we ask stakeholders for some information, this is all about gaining insights. All of the impact questions are about gaining insights. Often people see this final question as almost a way of giving away value. That's absolutely not the case. It's about understanding our contribution. It's about ensuring that we avoid overclaiming, claiming that we've changed people's lives and these things would never have happened and we're the only institution doing so, is presenting a false impression. We're all part of an ecosystem, we're all contributing to changes, but we are one body, one entity doing so. It can really help us identify other potential partners. Perhaps people we are working with are also working with other organisations. Well, perhaps next year we look to partner with that organisation to co-create even more value than we are doing in isolation. It can also provide us with the insight. Perhaps we find there are a group of people, a segment of our stakeholders, who do not need our support. Perhaps they would have experienced those changes without us. This gives us fantastic insight, and perhaps next time we identify a group of people we can work more with, and we'll create more value. This is really, really useful insight and often helps us avoid working with what the phrase, working with the low-hanging fruit. All of the impact questions then allow us to understand our contribution, our impact. The calculation to calculate impact is in front of you right now, but essentially what we need to understand, so this is for outcome A again, talking about the number of people who experience that change, outcome A. We multiply that by the value of the change, again, be it in a quantitative or a monetary sense. So the number of people experiencing the change multiplied by the value of that change, and we reduce that by those causality issues, reducing it by deadweight, displacement, and attribution. So as the formula shows in front, it is 1 minus deadweight. So if deadweight is 50%, we say 1 minus 0.5, and so on. That tells us the impact of each outcome in year 1. If the value of those changes has been projected to last for more than a single year, we take the value from the impact calculation year 1 and multiply it by 1 minus drop-off. So again, if drop-off is 20%, for example, it's the impact in year 1 multiplied by 1 minus 0.2. That gives us the impact in year 2. We repeat that calculation as required for the number of years that value is set to persist. The information we now have can really allow us to compare the value that we are creating for different stakeholders for different changes. This helps us to have that discussion initially to understand if all of those changes, those outcomes, are still material. Perhaps we identify changes where we are not really creating that much impact. The stakeholder is telling us that perhaps it's not that valuable. Perhaps those changes would have happened without us, without our intervention. This is helping us make a more informed judgment as to which changes are material, and therefore which matter to those people who are affected, and that will also affect our decision-making process. Now, of course, we may want to revisit this over time. Perhaps if we've excluded a particular change, it may be that next year or in a different period of time, we want to revisit that to check that is still the case. And of course, having set thresholds and targets, this also allows us to compare our actual results to those that we set as targets. Just to think about some of the issues around quantitative evidence gathering and analysis, One of the important questions that's often asked is how many responses we need. What sample size do we need when undertaking quantitative assessments? Well, it's a bit of a trick question because the answer is it really does depend on the decision being influenced. In the most rigorous sense, of course, we would aim to get representative samples, but the likelihood is that we may not get those representative responses. So we can do everything we can possibly do. We can segment our stakeholders. We can identify the different stratifications. We can send out a representative sample or aim for a representative response, but we may not get the responses that we wish. That does not stop us making decisions. As long as the information is good enough, again, enough precision for the decision, we should be able to use the information. It very much depends on the decision that is being influenced. The more rigorous the decision, or the more impactful the decision, the more costly it is to implement, the greater the number of people's lives affected and the extent of impact on their lives, we will need greater levels of precision. Now, within impact assessments, within social return on investment, we are making judgments. These are informed judgments, informed by our stakeholders and informed by existing evidence, but they are judgments nonetheless. So we can test these judgments. We're talking about doing sensitivity analysis. Essentially, what is suggested here is that you test a single variable at a time. You change one variable. It could be the quantity of people forecast to experience a change. It could be the value that people attribute to the change. It could be a deadweight percentage, an attribution percentage, and so on. Changing one variable at a time allows us to understand how sensitive that variable is. If the change, perhaps say from a 25% deadweight to a 75% deadweight, just as an example, if that has a significant effect on the results, we can identify that variable as being sensitive. What that tells us is we need more rigorous, more precise, more accurate information at that point. So next time we do our impact assessment, be it next month, next quarter, next year, we spend resources and our time getting better information there. If we find that that change of 25 to 75% deadweight or attribution doesn't have a significant effect on the result, that variable is less sensitive. We do not need to be as concerned getting more and more precise data there. We can probably say that that information is good enough. Further information on understanding, again, the materiality of those different effects, the sensitivity, is available on the Social Value UK and Social Value International websites. But again, thinking about ensuring that data is good enough, it very much depends on the type of decision being influenced. The table in front of you is intended to provide some indicative information as to the types of decision, the frequency of the decision, and the type of data that is required, along with the need for independent and external assurance. If the decision is strategic and therefore likely to be more costly and more impactful, the likely cost and consequence of getting the decision wrong is higher than other decisions, perhaps those changes in how we deliver a service, or the very small or the smaller scale modifications to our service delivery. You can see also the frequency of decisions. We don't make strategic decisions on a regular, i.e. weekly, monthly or quarterly basis. They're likely to be annual. Therefore, to inform those sorts of decisions that again are more costly and more impactful, we need a higher quality of data or a more rigorous set of data. There's also likely to be a higher requirement for independent assurance. This is again just intended to provide a general illustration of the types of decisions, their likely costs and consequences, the frequency of decision making, and so on. But again, each organisation will have to make their judgments. We all make decisions based on imperfect data. This is something we do all of the time. What social impact and impact management is intending to do is provide better information to help us make more informed decisions. Why do we do this? We believe fundamentally as Social Value International that making decisions that are more informed by stakeholders with a greater understanding of those changes, those outcomes, their significance, their value, their causality, we can reduce inequality, we can reduce the environmental harm that is produced by our decisions, and we can raise the well-being and quality of life. Please do have a look at our websites. Lots of information is freely available, and please do get in touch. Thank you very much.